Hi everybody. Thank you for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Pedro Ramaciotti Morales. Pedro did his PhD in applied mathematics at the École Polytechnique in France and has been a researcher at the computer science department at Sorbonne University and the Center of European Studies and the Media Lab at Sciences Po. He's also a fellow of the Learning Planet Institute of the University of Paris, where he founded the formal computational sociopolitics group or focus group. His research interests at the interface between social sciences and both computational and modeling approaches revolve around political dynamics in online social platforms, including online political competition systems, algorithm mediation, social movements, and media ecosystems. So it's a lot of the stuff that we're very interested in. So thank you so much, Pedro, for joining us today.
Of course, thank you for inviting me. So let me share my screen.
Yes, please.
Okay, I think everything's okay. You can see my screen, probably. Great. Yeah, so thank you for inviting me. Some of the things I will be presenting are maybe very obvious to you because you're experts in psychology too. And this is related to misinformation and polarization. This is a work that's been accepted in the ICWSM conference this year. And it's about the relation between misinformation and polarization in multidimensional polarization settings. So this is, as mentioned before, something we've been working on at the Media Lab at Sciences Po, but also in this other group, the focus group at the Learning Planet Institute, which is a lab in the University of Paris. So some of the results are can also be found in our webpage if you want to check them. There are a bunch of results about this and others about related research works. So first, something that, as I said, it might come as something obvious, especially in a psychology lab, but yeah, so the relation between misinformation and polarization comes at least in some of the hypotheses that have been put forward about what are the drivers of misinformation, with one line of hypothesis, of course, claiming that it is on individual cognitive traits that we can find the most important drivers, things such as acceptability of weak claims, lazy thinking, reflectiveness, while others, other line of research have been putting forward the idea that it is not in the individual, but in social systems that some of the explanation for the dissemination is, with people finding that misinformation is most shared in the political fringes, for example, in the US, and some other studies looking at how to control for variables that would appeal to this cognitive hypothesis come out still explaining polarization mostly in terms of polarization. So in this state of this debate, most of this evidence and the conceptualizations and the variables leverage in these empirical studies come from a US setting in which, of course, there's a question of binary divides in political preferences and the prevalence of liberal conservative cleavages in how people conceive research questions. So the problem for us is that when we want to test this kind of ideas in other settings, for example, the European one, the question of this importance of left-right cleavages or liberal conservative cleavages comes with an added complexity of the dimensionality of the political setting at hand. So here I'm illustrating this with an image I love from now kind of old article from more than a decade ago, in which authors take interest in measuring the dimensionality of party competition across Europe. So they take survey data in which experts have positioned parties in tens of dimensions, issue and policy and ideology dimensions, and they try to measure the dimensionality of the political competition space. So some countries, the UK, Poland, Sweden, can be somewhat reduced to one dimension, as in the US it's often done, but others, of course, would need more dimensions. So it all depends on the question of the national setting, but also in the sphere in which you're interested in polarization, if it is party competition or public polarization, for example. And the case I'm going to show is it's about France. So in France, for some years now, people have been putting forward the idea that what polarization is developing into is polarization among institutionalists and anti-elites rather than left-right or liberal conservative cleavage, which is, of course, the case often put forward for studies in the US. So the question in the study I'm going to show is if polarization is related to the dissemination of misinformation, how to tackle the question when this polarization seems to be multidimensional. So I'm going to take for this case study the French political Twitter space. To answer first, what is the relation between left-right polarization in this space and the different levels of engagement with misinformation online? And second, what is the role of this second dimension in how people are prone to share misinformation? And for that, one of the things I'll try to do is to develop a way in which to observe or at least portray these different polarizations along different dimensions. So I'm going to do this in three steps. So the first will be trying to take a significant part of Twitter political networks in France and embed them in multidimensional political spaces. Then, of course, trying to identify the users that share misinformation online to finally be able to say something about the relation between these two phenomena. So first, about embedding political Twitter networks in opinion spaces. So in France, following ideology scaling literature in the US, we also seeded a network from Twitter accounts of politicians. So annotated the Twitter accounts of members of parliament. Most of them have Twitter accounts belonging to 10 parties. This is data from 2019. So we collected all of the followers, nearly 5 million. And we then went on to collect the social graphs subtended by all of these users, but limited to those that had at least 25 followers, and that followed at least three members of parliament, so as to minimize the possibility that someone follows members of parliament for reasons other than policy alignment, for example, or ideology alignment. So this left us with a network, a social graph of 230,000 users around these political accounts. So in trying to produce an opinion space for this network, what we first looked at was the bipartite part of this topological data. So the part linking the accounts of members of parliaments with the followers. So we have this part, and we propose, as it's done in ideology scaling literature, an underlying plausible mechanism for the emergence of this data, in which we say that the probability of a user following a member of parliament has a probability that depends on a bunch of things. It depends on the level of activity of the user, on the level of popularity of the MP, but crucially, it depends inversely on the distance between these two in some unobservable opinion space, or something that will be driving and a space in which similarity would be driving this homophily manifested in someone following another. So we take this topological data, this bipartite part of our social graph, and we use this in Bayesian inference to infer estimations for these parameters, in particular, this unobservable positions in this space that would explain the observed homophily, for example. So, okay, we compute several dimensions, and we are able to then position all of our samples, so our followers and our politicians, in some latent space that, according to this equation, would be explaining the following behavior by homophily. So the number of dimensions to take in this, because if we follow this equation, if we believe this equation is behind this bipartite part, we have a way of evaluating the different importance that these dimensions would have in explaining this topological observation. And we see that a few dimensions have relatively high importance in explaining this bipartite graph. So we'll be looking first at the most explicative dimensions. And here on the right, I have the density of our 230,000 users in a plane formed by the first two dimensions. So the question now is, if this mechanism, this plausible mechanism is telling something about how people connect with politicians, and in these dimensions are useful in that they reflect something in which users might be judging of homophily with politicians, what are the underlying concepts that are being captured by this dimension. So when we were trying to make sense of these dimensions, we started, of course, looking at the position of politicians themselves. So what we did then was to highlight the positions of politicians. Here are in little crosses colored by political party, and that allowed us to take proxy of positions of parties in this space as this mean position or the centroids of the politicians of the same party, right? So for example, politicians of indomitable France, La France Insoumise, are in purple, and the centroid would say it's the party position. So in trying to make sense of this, here to the left is Indomitable France. So this is Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, for those that are a little familiar with French politics. So there's right next to it the French Communist Party. To the other side here, Rassemblement National is Marine Le Pen's party. LR is Sarkozy's party. So it would seem to capture something akin to left-right cleavages in France. To the top of the space, there's La République En Marche, which is Macron's party. So at this level, we are at individual subjectivity evaluation of the meaningfulness of the dimensions of this latent space. So in order to advance the interpretability of the spatial semantics, we went to look at political survey data. So we look at that year's Chapel Hill expert survey data. So in this data, researchers ask experts in European politics to position European parties along 51 policy and ideology dimensions. So there were in this wave in 2019, 212 experts that position parties in these 51 dimensions that include, of course, left-right positions, but also there's crucially a dimension measuring party attitudes towards elites and institutions, which is something which we're interested in the case of France, and a bunch of others related, for example, to tax redistribution, immigration policy, nationalism, religious principles, a bunch of other things that structure political debate. So 8 of the parties in this data set, with 51 dimensions, are also in our latent space, that dimension that we built with this ideal point estimation equation. So now we can begin testing the hunches we had about what dimensions stood for. For example, the one that would have seemed to capture some left-right cleavage, we can compare it with the survey's left-right dimension and determine to what degree this is ordering or positioning parties coherently, right? So a correlation says there is more or less something similar in between this dimension and the left-right dimension. So what we did then was to systematically run correlations for the first and the second latent space dimensions. So here's the first and the second column with all 51 dimensions of the survey. So here on the right, on the left is the correlation between the party positions in the first latent space dimension with all survey dimensions. So we see that it's positively correlated with a bunch of dimensions related to EU politics. So EU internal market, EU budget authority, opposing economic interventionism, and crucially to the bottom is negatively correlated, for example, with attitudes towards elites. So people that are high in this two-dimensional plane are very low in negative attitudes towards institutions and elites, and are very have positive attitudes towards European Union. The second dimension is very much correlated with right-wing economic policy, right-wing ideology, and a bunch of other issues that are often put together in left-right cleavages in French politics. So, for example, opposition for special rights for minorities, favoring religious principles, favoring nationalism. So at this level, we called this dimension that had this we're being correlated with party position in this space with these key issues. We call them local global dimensions, the first one, and left-right dimension, the second one. But up so far, what we have said is only pertaining to the positions of political parties, but the bulk of the users, we also wanted to check that they were coherently positioned in this space. For this, we took the text that people use in their Twitter profiles. So in their Twitter profiles, people more often than we had imagined before are advancing a lot of attitudes in text that are related to the dimensions we want to capture. So people would say, for example, I'm leftist, I'm rightist, etc. So for example, to test these two dimensions, we filter people that would use in their Twitter profile the keywords people and elites. So people that are subscribing to this discursive criticism of institutions and elites. And we map the density of these people across this first dimension to see that they were densely packed to the bottom of the plane and monotonically so. Also people referring to Europe, for example, people saying I'm a proud European, they are densely packed to the top of the space, monotonically so. We also control for people saying left and right, and they are densely packed to the right of the space or to the left of the space. We filter in some of these cases, of course, by negative sentiments so as to try to minimize the probability that what they are uttering is some kind of criticism. We tested in some other publications if these groups now of the whole population, but distinguished by how they describe themselves in profiles, can be their positions can be used for a linear classifier, and it turns out that these dimensions are distinguishing them enough so that a linear classifier can separate them with high precision and recall. So up until this point, politicians are coherently positioned. Through surveys, we think we have an interpretation of what dimensions are, but also the rest of our sample, of our large sample, is now coherently positioned too along these dimensions. So up until here, what's interesting is that we have only used text to try to validate the meaning of our dimensions, but what dimensions come from is purely from graph structures which are textless. So social graph structures contain already information about people's attitudes towards several political issues, which is interesting. So we have our space with people positioned along two dimensions that are of interest to us. And now onto the task of trying to identify where misinformation is being spread. So for that, we went to data from another platform. We use Facebook third-party fact-checking program. So this is the social science 1 exabyte data set. So these are URLs that had been shared at least 100 times around the period of our study. So they have for URLs different labels, but we took those containing signaling that the content was false, or a mixture, or false in headline. So for those we identified as misinformation in this study. So with that, we identified nearly 2,000 false stories in French, and we went on to collect all the tweets that contained these URLs. So we obtained around 340,000 tweets. So we went on to check who are the people that matches in our space, and we have 15,000 of people in our sample that are also sharing these tweets. So here on the left is our latent space with the interpretation that is derived from the survey, the political survey of party positioning, and on the right, the density of people that is sharing misinformation. So up until here, the conclusion would seem to be similar to that in the United States, in that it would seem that we have more people on the right, but also it's something related to left-right extremes, except that in here, there are a bunch of problems, some new and some old. The first is that in this latent space, of course, we don't have references because these equations is invariant to translation. So for identification, what's normally done in ideal point estimation is to force the mean of the sample to 0. But 0 here does not necessarily mean to be centrist in this scale. The second question also related to that is that the way in which polarization is operationalized in these studies is some notion of extremism or distance to the center. So we have no way of saying if people here on position 2 are half as polarized as people in position -4, for example. Then there are other questions related to the fact that this part of the ideal point estimation equation is also invariant to rotation. So it would seem that dimension 2, it's capturing some left-right concept, but it might be a better indicator if we try to rotate it. So we would lose or gain as an indicator for some of the issues that are aligned with the second dimension, but it's very hard to at this point try to say something of one particular issue. So what we did then is a method that we call language independent network attitudinal embedding, in which we produce the first latent embedding in which we have preserved homophily, but then map these positions onto the dimensions of the political instrument, in this case, the Chapel Hill expert survey, which dimensions have references and an explicit meaning. For this, we use the positions of the parties. We minimize a metric of distance of parties in arrival space. So once we have computed the mapping from one space to the other, here on the left, the latent space, and on the right, the chess space, we can use the same transformation to move our 230,000, so our large sample, to the positions of in the dimensions of the Chapel Hill expert survey. So in here, in blue, there's the density of the people in the dimensions of the survey. But here, we have several advantages. So here, dimensions are explicitly associated to a concept. So we have the chess left-right dimension and the chess anti-elite dimension. In this, for example, left-right dimension, 5 is identified as the centrist position. So experts, when they are answering the survey, the answer is posted in that fashion. Where would you position this party, with 0 being extreme left, 10 being extreme right, 5 being the center in the left-right dimension? Similar for the other dimensions. So we have explicit bounds. So here the square are the bounds of the survey. Parties are, of course, inside, but parties are mean positions of users of politicians. So the rest of the users can overflow beyond the reference points of the survey. So with that, we also, again, in this space, control for the coherence in the position of these 250,000 users. So again, if we look at the profiles and identify who's declaring themselves to be left-wing or right-wing, they are again sufficiently separated so that our linear classifier can identify them with high precision or recall. So we have solved the problem of a space in which to operationalize this notion of polarization as extremism, as distance from the center or from the reference points. We have identified who is sharing misinformation, so we now can try to look at the relation between the two. So here what we have is, on the top is the chess left-right dimensions with the reference points 0, 5, and 10. On the bottom is the anti-elite dimensions, and here is the density of people that are sharing misinformation in our sample. So as in the US, it would seem that in extreme positions, people have higher probability, have shown to have higher probability of sharing misinformation. And now in this new dimension, we see that it is only people that display high anti-elite, anti-establishment attitudes that are sharing misinformation. Here, the dotted horizontal line is the mean of the whole sample. So because at the extremes, there are less people in our sample, the confidence intervals are wider. So comparatively in the extreme left for parties and extreme right for parties, the amount of sharing of misinformation is somewhat similar. But here, of course, it's more easy to say that it is with high anti-elite, anti-establishment attitude that comes the very distinctive behavior in sharing misinformation. But coming back to the geometrical view showing two dimensions at once, this is the same, which we lose the visual perception of the confidence interval. So here I'm showing the means by position. So we see the density of users in the extreme left and extreme right. Here are the points A and C that are sharing misinformation. They are in the anti-elite part of the space, but we also see a more complex patterns. For example, this is density, right? So it's not the volume of users. So there are ways of being very left-right polarized, but not displaying enough anti-elite, anti-establishment sentiment, in which you will be in a population that normally does not share as much misinformation. And also, if you have high anti-elite and anti-establishment sentiments, but you are not sufficiently polarized on the left-right dimension, you're also less prone to sharing misinformation. So coming back to the geometrical view, also adds a pattern of complexity of how these populations are arranged. So to finish this, we looking at this French political Twitter graph, we kind of found something coherent with what other studies have been saying, in that it is mainly structured first around the question of global-local, we called local-global issues, and then left-right, mixing expert perception through the surveys and collective perception through this interactional data traces, the following network. We kind of became overcome the shortcomings of the ideology scaling problem. And then to our questions, the left-right polarization, yes, was related to misinformation, similarly as the case of the US, but the anti-elite establishment polarization showed to be more clearly defining the population, that the fraction of the population that shares misinformation. And again, coming to this geometrical vision also provides a more complex pattern of how these populations are arranged. This is interesting because while we use text to validate the positions in space, this is textless, so language independent. So this is something that we have done in other countries. For example, in Italy, it turns out to be exactly the same. And this has, of course, many other applications that we have pursued in other publications in trying, for example, to leverage the space to look at how algorithms are recommending content with different stances to different people in different positions of space, in trying to analyze the dimensionality of different, not only countries, but different digital arenas inside a country, or even in subpopulations such as those of a political movement, for example. Yeah. so here, I think I'll stop here. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Really a great talk. I think we can open this up for discussion right now. So please raise your hand if you want to ask some questions. Um, so, um, yeah, terrific. Questions, anyone? Or I'll start. Wait, Steve, are you waving? We can't hear you. Okay, just we'll let Steve fix his.
Yeah,
audio.
I'll try and fix this. I'm going back to my laptop.
Yeah, okay. Great. So I might as well start. So I thought that this was a really interesting case of trying to separate the what the roots of or the different dimensions of polarization. And I was wondering, and this is really relates to some of the work that we're doing in our lab in Bristol, about the first dimension that relates to to um, to attitudes towards elites and institutions. I think that in a lot of ways, what we're doing, we would say that this is some kind of a populist way of thinking, or populist attitudes. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts of relating this to populism.
Yes, of course, in the sense that populism is a way of challenging established institutions and democracies to some extent. It would need to relate to that, but also in between that and a pure visual examination of these results. Because up until here, this is just a dimension. Up until here, I mean, in what I presented, this is just a dimension. It could have been another, except that this is not any dimension. It turns out to be the first structuring, the social graph I used, but it's also a dimension that is very important because it's also reflective of epistemic power. So established institution and elites are very related to, for example, to scientific establishment and to traditional media. So it is not completely separated from the fact that people that would try to propose an opposition or to challenge, for example, scientific established facts, for example, would be also very revealingly described by this dimension.
Thanks. Steve.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. Really interesting. I was wondering if you had a chance to look at the type of misinformation that was shared. Now, you kind of gave us the quantities and extremes of the left-right, but did you have any sense of the content per se? What was it that was in there that people were misinforming with?
Yeah, so in this, I tried to open the article and I somehow lost control of my Windows. But what I'm trying to show you is again the slide in which we have the 3 points, right? Okay, I'm back to it. So we did a qualitative study on the most shared misinformation in these 3 points. So, for example, in point C, which is near to far-right candidates, it's mostly about immigration. On point A, related to far left politics, it's related to finance. things related to kind of deep state things. And in point B, it's about something that I would very shortly describe as esoteric kind of fake news, like alternative medicine, things like that.
Okay, thank you. And can I follow up if no one else raises their hand? You mentioned Italy briefly, and I think you said it's the same there. Did I hear that right? You just mentioned it very briefly.
Yeah, we developed this as some sort of confirmation that was asked for robustness, and we observed the same in the sense that if these two dimensions are built again from Italian data, you also observe two focuses of high probability of sharing misinformation to the extreme left and right, and to the very anti-elite part of the space.
Hannah.
I want to kind of check on one of my interpretations from your results, which is that usually in the US and also in several other countries, there's this imbalance between the political right sharing more misinformation or believing more misinformation, being more polarized even. And your results don't look like that to me. You do seem to see as much on the left as on the right. And so I wonder if France is a country where this is more common, or if you think it might be a consequence of the two dimensions you're looking at. And so you're also getting attitudes that aren't merely left-right, but anti-elite. And therefore, some people that wouldn't be so left would also be counted among the more frequent spreaders of fake news. So just any kind of interpretation from you on this would be super interesting.
Yeah, I really don't know. I think that I don't have strong evidence to support anything that I could say to compare the two, but I think the sort of alignment between the traditional cleavage in the US and other tensions that are related to trust in institutions, for example, which are again related to scientific institution and people that have an institution that have epistemic powers in establishing truth and falseness in the US is more aligned than in France. In France, I would imagine it to be more orthogonal, for example.
Yeah. Interesting, thank you.
Yes, so I'll take a follow-up. Oh no, I'll leave it to Julia.
Please shoot first. If it's a follow-up, then I'll go, because this is a completely different question.
Okay, then so it relates to also some part of Steve's questions is also Hannah, and this is really how much of those dimensions really apply to the French context, because I think that we can we know that usually, as you said at the beginning, this type of research is done on American data, and as you just mentioned, there's some sort of more of alignment on the different axes in the American case, and I wonder whether you think that these two different components of polarization is something that should be applied to polarization research in general, when it doesn't really matter, like, whether we're studying the French context, the Italian, the Israeli one, or the US, which happens to have those two aligned because of the two-party system.
Yeah, I think that when looking at misinformation, for example, producing positioning in a traditional polarization scale, such as left-right, but also in some kind of dimension measuring trust in institutions, attitude towards institution is very useful for the reasons that we've been discussing. It doesn't mean that it is necessarily the case that most countries will be highly polarized around that dimension. But what we have seen, for example, maybe I have some of these here is that, for example, we did similarly as we did in France. This is a sample from another year. So we produced the same embedding in France, but also in Italy, Germany, and Spain. And it wasn't the case that the most explicative latent dimension was highly correlated with attitudes towards elites and institutions in all of the countries. It was certainly the case again in France in the year in which we ran the results for this study, but sufficiently enough with other dimensions so that meaningful embeddings in these two dimensions could be achieved. Also trying to validate for the positions of users, looking then at the text they produce. So this is another interesting thing that because it is textless and because it relies on an instrument that has been applied in a similar way in similar countries, it can be comparable then for these kind of studies. But it doesn't mean, of course, coming back to your question, that it is to be expected that in all countries this should be a very important dimension in regards to how tensions, how dissimilar political attitudes are.
Thank you. Yuda.
Hi, very interesting talk. I have two questions regarding the sample or the patterns that you observed. One being, I'm not sure if you mentioned that in your talk, whether you included only political misinformation or health information. Did you discern different types of misinformation?
No, we took everything that was in this Facebook exobyte dataset. So this is information that follows in the scope of the annotators of the fact-checking network of Facebook, because it has been signaled, I think, by users themselves to be submitted to the attention of then fact-checker that do the manual fact-checking. So this is all sorts of misinformation. And then, for example, when we did the qualitative inspection of what kind of misinformation, the part that is in the center of the left-right scale is really not related to political misinformation. But then this again would introduce some kind of bias for which we are not controlling, which is maybe the fact that people are more prone to signal in the platform that something, it seemed for them to be misinformation, maybe more so or more frequently so, I mean, when it is about politics. So there could be some kind of maybe bias in that sense.
Yeah, because I was also wondering if in the context of the anti-establishment dimension, this is a pattern that you observe in political misinformation more so than in others, if this anti-establishment curve is kind of generalizable across topics. And then regarding the other dimension, I was wondering if you included also posts linking to true information. It was only false information, right? Yeah. Because then would we see the same pattern if we included posts linking to true information also? Or is this kind of pattern unique to misinformation spreading, or is kind of the underlying behavior partisan sharing, so that people on the extreme ends are more inclined to share information in general? Like, yeah, something I was wondering. Maybe it would be cool to also include true information and then kind of compare the patterns or something.
Yeah, we explored this a little bit, maybe not in the sense that we kind of propose true information, but compared how this with how it be transformed if it were normalized by level of activity of users, because it will. I think your question points to the fact that maybe these people in the extremes are sharing more, so they maybe have like the same propensity of sharing misinformation by level of tweets they share. It's just that they are tweeting so much. We tried to produce a normalization that would take this into account, so normalized by the level of activity of users, and it turns out that it's still, I don't have it here, but it's still less markedly so, but still noticeable that people in the most anti-elite part of the spectrum is sharing more misinformation per tweet. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Very interesting.
Thanks. Do we have more questions? Okay. Well, Pedro, yes, Steve.
Well, just saying again, it was a really great talk, very interesting. Oh, actually, I do have a question, if you don't mind. You mentioned something that intrigued me, and it had something to do with rotation invariance and different attitude clusters or something. And I think I know what you mean by that, but could you be a bit more specific about that? How does that work? Because it sounds very powerful to me as a diagnostic tool.
So probably was here. So because of how the equation of the ideal point estimation equation based on item response theory. So what it's taking into account is the distance, and the distance would be preserved through a rotation in the space. So if we took the latent space and produced some rotation,
okay,
and then so it would lead to the same observable topological data. This means that if we want to say that one of the dimensions stands for some attitude because it's correlating with dimension from a study, it would be the case that maybe rotating the latent space, we could improve correlation with one issue of the survey, but impoverishing others. So the dimension 2 would seem to be somewhere in the middle of a lot of issues that are very well aligned. And by rotating it, we would improve or impoverish others. So producing this kind of transformation is a way of isolating these effects.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
And I think it was one of your hidden slides, which wasn't in the talk itself, but there was also one about the democratic authoritarian scale that I was interested about.
Yeah, I can present that in a minute. So this is an article we published in Party Politics, in which we looked at the Turkish political Twitter sphere. And one of the things we saw with political surveys done in Turkey is that, contrary to the expectation, which was that the main cleavage was the traditional Kurdish Turkish one, attitudes towards authoritarianism had overtaken, at least on that year, as the main divisive line in this particular political online sphere. So we positioned parties and a bunch of people in this space, but what we did then was to look at how they were sharing links from traditional media through different years. In particular, before and after some important change in ownership of traditional media in Turkish. So what we managed to show is that through the years, and especially after this change in ownership, people that have been sharing URLs from traditional media are more and more to the authoritarian side of the spectrum.
So is that because now they share traditional media that is more authoritarian? Is it traditional media has shifted, or it's that now that they share news what was the shift? Was the shift in what, or I don't know if you can answer that, but was the shift in the individuals or in the media outlets?
So the hypothesis here is that through changes in traditional media, for example, ownership, it has been catering or finding more readership or people willing to share their URLs in more and more authoritarian, or people more acceptant of authoritarian views.
I see. Very interesting. Okay. So if there are no more questions, I just want to thank you again for giving this talk. It was really fascinating, I think, and yeah, and thank you for sharing the research with us.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. It was great. I hope to maybe see some of you in the project we have with some of you together in Song for Them. I guess I'll be seeing some of you at least. Very, very much looking forward to. Have a nice evening and a nice weekend.
You too. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.